To my talk, I think I started without clicking one of the buttons I needed to, and I apologize. Let me go back and just review very quickly. Paul George, History of Miami, with another history presentation, talking today about the Burdine family and their namesake department store, which was really the giant of retail stores in Miami. My relationship to it, other than the fact that as a child, sometimes I'd go with my mother down there when she went shopping. There were sales just a couple times a year, and she would always buy clothing, among other things, for myself, my brother and sister, my father and her. I remember very well at Christmas time how exciting it was to visit Burdine's. I mean, we all did. Anybody who grew up in Miami of yesteryear recalls all that. But I did receive a call about 30 years ago from Margaret Walker, a writer who was friends with members of the Burdine family, asking me to meet with them with the probability and possibility of writing a history of both the family and the store. And so I met with them in Fort Lauderdale. One of the people who was there at the meeting was Zeta Phipps, who was the daughter of Rowdy Burdine, who was the great merchant prince of Burdine's, who took it to all kinds of dizzying heights from the time he took over at age 23 in 1911 until his death in the early part of 1936. And so we agreed that I would research and write a history of the Burdine family and the store. And when the research began, I began to dig deep into U.S. Census tracts and learned that the early Burdine's presence in America was in South Carolina, and the family began to move in a southwesterly direction, Georgia, Alabama, ultimately Mississippi. The family came from France. They were French Huguenots, in fact, who came here in the 18th century to colonial America. And that's where young William Burdine, who was founder of the chain, was living at the time of the Civil War. His father, William Burdine's father, was a Methodist minister, so the family was really steeped in religion early on, and William certainly carried that forward too in his lifetime. His heroic service in the Confederate armies is really something that's notable. That is that on the eve of the Civil War, he enlisted in the Confederate forces in a Mississippi unit, was wounded twice in battle, fought in other major battles, was taken prisoner toward the latter part of the war in December of 1864, and placed in a prison in Ohio. In fact, he was still there when the Civil War ended in April of 1865. He wasn't released until June of 1865. In fact, if one visits the city cemetery, up until about a year or so, when it mysteriously disappeared, there was a tombstone in front of this really beautiful Burdine family mausoleum, which is Art Nouveau in design. And the tombstone had across it CSA 1861-1865, meaning Confederate States of America, which was around during that period of time, from the early part of 1861 until the Civil War ended in 1865, marking the collapse in the ending, of course, of the Confederacy. William returned to Mississippi after the war, and he taught school for a while, and then he served a long stint as a pharmaceutical clerk in a pharmacy, as well as a store that rendered other goods to customers. He was married within a few years of the end of the Civil War. He and his wife had a few children, and then she passed away. And he would remarry about 10 to 15 years after that, and would have a whole new family then with his second wife, Mary, sometimes known as Molly Burdine. Meantime, his health was failing. He had respiratory problems, and William Burdine decided to move with his family to Florida, away from the kind of cold, wet Mississippi winters, to Florida in 1890, and they arrived in Polk County, which would be in central West Florida. The county seat there is Bartow. But rather than living in Bartow, he lived in a little place called Homeland, which had less than 1,000 people. They cultivated orange groves, as well as vegetables and other fruit. He dabbled in real estate. He was very, very active in the Methodist church in his community. In fact, was one of the elders of the church. And that's where he lived for several years. There were two great freezes that we mentioned a couple of talks ago that hit Florida, all the way down to today's Palm Beach County in December of 1894 and early February of 1895. And they just kind of wiped out a lot of the groves and farmland that William Burdine had been cultivating. And so he then moved into the county seat at Bartow and went into partnership with a man named Henry Payne and opened up something called Burdine and Payne, which was a general goods store, which was like an early version of a department store. Within about a year or so, he bought out Henry Payne, and he brought his oldest son from his first marriage, John Burdine, into him, and it became W.M. Burdine and Son. We're now looking at the year 1898, and the Burdine family learned that there was a Spanish-American War encampment of great size in Miami in the summer of 1898. In fact, there were about 7,000 soldiers who were in a town, Miami, that had probably about 1,200 people at the time. And they lived in camps known as Camp Miami. They lived in a camp setting that would be north of today's downtown, from roughly around 2nd Street, where Jesuit Catholic Church is, north past the Miami News Freedom Tower, all the way over to the bay, and then west to the Florida East Coast Railway railroad tracks. And so when William Burdine learned about that, he dispatched his son John with a wagon load of men's clothing. And John moved in a southeasterly direction diagonally across the peninsula of Florida from Bartow to Miami. And what he did was he picked up on military trails and roads that had been created during two so-called Indian Wars, the Second and Third Seminole Wars. And he came over to an area, we believe, somewhere close to the intersection of today's South Miami Avenue and Flagler Street, which was the busiest intersection in Miami for decades. And there he set up shop in this wagon, and he sold everything in his inventory. And when he got back to Bartow, he told his father, said, things are booming down there. I guess in more ways than one, because the place was in a frenzy that summer. And his father listened to him and kind of considered what he said, and he said, I think we need to move to Miami and set up shop there. In fact, William Burdine later explained his move to the Magic City. He said, and I quote, "I found trade growing duller at Bartow. This place," meaning Miami, "was springing up and seemed to have a future. So I pulled up and moved here." Years later, his son Rowdy Burdine further explained that the family moved to Miami because it was, and I quote, "at the time the brightest spot in Florida." Now, the Burdine family arrived in Miami about August of 1898, and William Burdine, with his oldest son John, opened a store in a very small, narrow arcade on the west side of today's Miami Avenue, then called Avenue D, a little bit south of what's today's Flagler Street, then known as 12th Street. Very cramped quarters. He stocked it with tremendous goods. His clientele was very enthusiastic about the offerings in the store. His best clients were Miccosukee and Seminole Indians, only then defined as Seminoles. And it was kind of a cash and carry business. They would come in with money, oftentimes having sold some of their goods to other so-called Indian traders like the Brickles, as well as a man named James Gertman who lived near Flagler and the Miami River. And they would come in and they would buy vests and heavy gold watch chains and derby hats and calico cloth, among other products. As Burdines grew, he said, or decided, I need bigger quarters. And so William Burdine and his son John moved the store at the beginning of the 1900s around the corner to 12th Street, that is, again, Flagler Street, a little bit east of Miami Avenue on the south side of the street, in a recently completed building called the Hatchet Building, 2 stories. And now we begin to see an emerging department store, different departments. Every summer, William Burdine would go to New York, and he would just buy up as much inventory as he could and then come back with that. And he was beginning to really stock a lot of new inventory in his new quarters. Meanwhile, the Burdine family, as the family began to prosper, they began to move about town too. The Burdine family of the early 1900s were living in this beautiful Fort Dallas Park neighborhood that had been created by Julia's son, Harry Tuttle. It was on the north bank of the river, and it was bracketed by Miami Avenue on the west and southeast, 1st Avenue on the east, 2nd Street southeast on the north. They lived there. And then later on, they moved to where the 50 Biscayne building would be today at the corner of Flagler Street and Biscayne Boulevard, and a beautiful residential area of single-family homes that was beginning to rise then in the early 1900s. So the family really had some nice settings. There was a fracture in the business that occurred in 1903 when John Burdine married Pauline Quarterman. Quarterman's mother was Eva Quarterman, who was a seamstress in the Burdine store. Pauline was somebody who was really good at setting up window displays for various products that the store was carrying. And William married Pauline, and they broke with William. Brought along the mother, Eva Monroe, with them, and they moved about a block east and opened up something called Burdine and Quarterman, which was essentially a women's clothing and notion store, as they were described at that time, on today's Southeast First Avenue off of Flagler Street. So now it became just W.M. Burdine, the store. Meantime, Rowdy Burdine, who was born in 1887, probably named for a Confederate officer from Mississippi. The name is very unusual, Roddey. Rowdy Burdine had joined the store. Rowdy had grown up in Miami from the time they were there. He was still a kid. He played a lot of sports. He loved to fish. He loved to boat. He was kicked out of the public school one day, and he decided the next day he was going to go out boating with his best friend, a man named George Whitten, who had a major role in the story after that. They went out into the Biscayne Bay, and the boat capsized. Even though the bay isn't deep, in some areas you can find deep water, and they had a lot of trouble trying to get that boat and get on that boat and get out of the bay. They were rescued by somebody who then took Rowdy Burdine and George Whitten over to William Burdine. He was a very stern person. And William Burdine said, "You're out of school permanently. You begin working with us tomorrow at the store." And Rowdy then, from the early 1900s until he took over in 1911, would become familiar with and work in every department of the store. And as the store grew, it accrued more and more departments. So he was really ready at age 23 to take control. He had a great way about him. He was great with employees, the proverbial hands-on boss. A lot of people, in fact, thought that when he took the helm of the store, it was just an example of nepotism. He was too young to be able to manage a store like this because it was the premier store at that time. Now, when Rowdy took over in 1911, at age 23, the first thing he announced was he was going to build a bigger store. He was going to build at least for that time, a skyscraper, a 5-story store. In fact, it was said that when it was completed at a cost of $60,000, that it was the tallest building south of Jacksonville, which was a major city in Florida already by that time. It was known as the Big Store, and a lot of people, of course, saw it as a landmark in the area. In fact, it was so big that Burdine's only occupied the first 2 floors, and then there were offices on the top 3 floors. In fact, you had a lot of attorneys, for example, who maintained offices in the Big Store, one of whom was Henry Flagler's attorney. Rowdy, as the store succeeded, and he would make his annual trips also, really began to gain a reputation as a merchandising genius and all the way he stocked the store and the way the store handled everything. And he begins to assume the name given to him, the moniker, the Merchant Prince. And the store grew. One of the favorite things that people would do when they came to the store, and a lot of kids would come to the store, it was kind of like a hangout. There were a lot of movie theaters downtown at that time, still silent movies. But a lot of the kids liked to come to the store because there was a big sign-in book once you passed the entrance on today's Flagler Street. And you would look at the book to see who among your friends, perhaps, was already in the store. And then you would sign in yourself so people would know that you were there. So Burdine's was really moving along very quickly. There was further expansion by 1920 on the other side, the south side of the store. The Burdines bought some property on the south side, and they built a major addition there, looking out over what was then 13th Street, today's Southeast 1st Street. In 1924, they bought additional property around the store, around the western parts of it, facing 1st Street, and built some more floors in that particular area. Everything really reached a crescendo in 1925, the height of the great real estate boom of that era. And there was dizzying success for Burdine's store. The boom was a major thing to behold. We talked about it last Friday among our history topics. We really didn't talk about the downtown street life during the boom. Flagler Street was the epicenter of the boom. That's where literally the buying and selling of real estate took place. That's where there was music sometimes late into the night by small combos provided by developers whose offices looked out onto the street between essentially 1st and 2nd Avenues on both sides of the street. That's where everything took place, it seemed. And here was Burdine's, just a block west of there, less than a block west of there, looking out over that very, very busy street. Just to show you what was going on, though, in terms of Burdine's and its success at that time, Here are some of the statistics for the fiscal year 1925-26. Burdines at that point employed 1,750 persons. They built new housing for, in today's Silver Bluff, they built new housing for employees. They built a warehouse and delivery station on Southwest 8th Street and 6th Avenue. Their sales that fiscal year, were recorded at something like $10 million, which was the largest ever for department stores south of Baltimore. The family was by then heavily involved in the store. William Burdine Jr., Willie, was vice president. His brother, who was an attorney, Robert Freeman, known as Freeman, was secretary-treasurer. The best friend of Rowdy's, George Whitten, who was considered another member of the family, was also vice president of the store, later to become president. And Bess Burdine, the youngest member of the family, the daughter, she was married to Admiral Putty Reed. And Putty Reed himself was an amazing story. They met at the Dinner Key Naval Air Station in World War I in Coconut Grove, courted at that time, married. And Putty Reed, at the outset of the 1920s, or the very end of the 19-teens, was one of the first people to cross the Atlantic by airplane. Now, what distinguishes him from Charles A. Lindbergh is the fact that Lindbergh never stopped on his crossing. He went from Long Island to Paris. Putty Reed went from an airfield on the East Coast to the Azores Islands, a few hundred miles away from Portugal, the Portuguese coast. And then he resumed his flight sometime after that and reached the European mainland. So he was one of the first as an aviator to cross the Atlantic Ocean. So you had Bess as the younger member of the family, very involved with a lot of exciting things going on in her life. Mary, or Molly Burdine, was this really stabilizing presence in the family, and the family was very close to their mother. Rowdy continued to be the hands-on boss that he was, despite the great success of the store, and it was huge. It offered 48 different departments by 1926. It had a rooftop garden, on-site parking, tea room, and now it was expanding to other venues. There was a Miami Beach store that opened up on Lincoln Road, and later another one on the Ronnie Plaza Hotel, which was state-of-the-art 1926 hotel on Collins Avenue. They opened up a store in West Palm Beach, another one in 1929 on Biscayne Boulevard in the Adrian R. Center neighborhood today. In fact, on part of that site where the center is, known as a Boulevard Shop Store. Another one in Fort Lauderdale later on. But the Great Depression hit Burdines hard, as it did most retail in the area, although it continued to be profitable even during the Great Depression. And by the mid-1930s, the store was back on its feet. In fact, it ranked 10th in the mid-1930s in sales among the nation's department stores. Meantime, Rowdy Burdine, who had unlimited energy, was involved in so many civic endeavors. He chaired the Florida Racing Commission. He was a great sportsman and founder of the Miami Country Club in the mid-1920s. He led the city of Miami's annexation drive in the summer of 1925 that resulted in the great expansion of Miami into a 43-square-mile city. He was an organizer of the Better Business Bureau. He was an officer of the Community Chest. He was one of the founders of the Orange Bowl Classic, known initially as the Palm Festival. And all the while, he was also continuing to expand. In fact, he decided that Burdines really needed a much more fashionable store, a much larger store on Lincoln Road, and so he bought property at 800 Lincoln Road and built this great streamlined modern Art Deco store that opened up in February of 1936. The problem was that Rowdy was too sick to attend the opening. The opening, they flew in models from New York. They had spotlights all over Miami Beach. He was suffering from undulant fever, or brucellosis, which is a disease that you contract from unpasteurized milk. And he died within a week or so of the opening of the Lincoln Road store. Huge outpouring of grief in Miami. Front page editorials, front page stories about his life. About a year later, the brand new stadium was completed that we later knew as the Orange Bowl. And during a chilly night in December of 1937, his widow, his daughters, and other members of the family were there for the dedication of the stadium, which was named Rowdy Burdine Stadium. In fact, the Orange Bowl was known as Rowdy Burdine Stadium until the Miami City Commission officially changed the name in 1950. Meantime, going back to the early 1900s building that we've talked about, the big building which grew over time and got larger and larger as time went on. had a major expansion in the 1930s to keep up with this tremendous growth in the business. And they moved all the way down to the corner of Miami Avenue, facing Flagler Street. And there they designed and built a beautiful, streamlined, modern building, the building we see today. You could walk downtown today and you'd see that building standing there. It was completed in 1938. World War II comes along, the war is over, there's a tremendous surge in consumer spending. And as a result of that, the Burdine people said, we need bigger facilities. And so they built the annex, a 5-story annex across the street, also streamlined, modern Art Deco. That would be on the west side of Miami Avenue, facing Flagler Street. It was connected by a bridge at the 3rd and 4th floor levels. And on that bridge is where a giant neon illuminated Santa Claus stood, illuminated every Thanksgiving night from 1950 through 1960 to announce the Christmas season. There were also rides on the roof of the Burdine's Annex building on the west side of Miami Avenue. So its success continued. The Burdine family, which were by far the largest stockholders in the Burdine enterprise, decided to sell their enterprise to Federated Department Stores in 1956. And they were able to shift their stock from Burdine's to Federated, so they still held a lot of stock in that building. Burdine's continued to grow as part of Federated's holdings. They had several other department stores throughout the United States. Until by the early part of the 2000s, Burdine's in Florida had close to 55 department stores. And of course, it was calling itself the Florida store, had been for a long time. It was featuring Sunshine Fashions, and that went back to the 1920s. The name changed in 2005. It became part of Macy's. A lot of us continue to call it Burdine. Sometimes to be charitable, we called it Burdine/Macy's. And as I mentioned before, unfortunately, the store closed in downtown Miami in 2017. The Dadeland store, for at least a few decades, was the busiest of all the Burdine stores in the chain, as well as the busiest suburban department store in the United States. So we've gone through the Burdine story, and I'm just wondering if there's any questions. I'm looking at Maria Helmley seems to be with us. She was one of the people as a young girl. She was the granddaughter of the first mayor of Miami. As a young girl, she would go into the Burdine store and sign her name in that book. She told me that in a letter just about a month ago. Melissa Myers watching, thank you. Carolyn Brownstein, thank you. She traveled to Miami from Indiana by train at age 17 in 1956, and her visit to Burdine's was the highlight of her day. Ronald Reisner, what store currently occupies a Burdine store on Lincoln Road? It was an art collective there for many years, 800 Lincoln Road. The property was sold for an astronomical amount of money, and I'm not sure what's on that site right now, but a very, very valuable site. Julie Cason's in the United Kingdom. That's great. Does the museum or anyone have a copy of the sign-in book when people entered the Burdine store? If so, any interesting names? I will check on that and see if we might have it. That would be just terrific if we did. Let's see. Thanks for these talks from Anita Chang. Thank you. Patricia Roth, I hope you're able to tune in okay. Hi, Karen. Ron. Thanks, Julie. Danielle, thank you. Michelle, thanks. Casey says, we're so sorry, that Casey Wood, that our private Miami River tour was canceled. We'll pick it up again, trust me. Lainey's watching, thank you. Aaron, Vanessa, Arlene. I want to thank you all so much for tuning in today. And tomorrow we're going to look at the Art Deco district and the role of people like Barbara Kapman and the artist community, the gay community, Tony Goldman, modeling agencies, Miami Vice, and all the elements that turned around that area about 30 plus years ago and made it the very interesting, crazy place that it is today. So I look forward to sharing this with you tomorrow, and thanks so much for tuning in. You can probably hear the parakeets in the background. Thank you.